Well, as we know, Peter is in Jerusalem and has been traveling around in the area of Judea. Verse 31 that we just read tells us that the Christians are experiencing a time of peace and rest. And so Peter takes this time to travel to the churches in the areas around Jerusalem to kind of check in on them and encourage them. And so here on our map, which hopefully is clear enough, you can see Jerusalem is down here. And this is the area of Judea and then Samaria where Peter was earlier. And so he's been traveling around in this area. In Acts chapter 8, we saw that he traveled to the city of Samaria, which is up in here, and gave approval to the conversion of the Samaritans. And he also confronted Simon the sorcerer with his false understanding of the gospel when he was there. And then it says that on his way back to Jerusalem, he and his companions stopped at many of the villages along the way and preached the gospel to the Samaritans. So they kind of worked their way back through this area, back down to Jerusalem. And now Peter is working his way at least through some of the area of Judea. And he comes to a town called Lydda, which is up here. So he's working through to the northwest, and then he'll end up here in Joppa. And then we'll see next week in chapter 10, is that he ends up in Caesarea up here. So he's working this route there. So he gets to Lydda. Now Lydda is located about 25 miles northwest of Jerusalem along a major north-south highway. So this is an area where there's a lot of traveling, a lot of people coming through. So it's probably, it may be a smaller city, but it's one that gets a lot of traffic and gets a lot of people coming through there. Acts chapter 9, though, is the only time that Lydda is mentioned in the New Testament, and I believe even in all of Scripture. And so Peter goes there to check on the church in Lydda, and here's a picture of that area. Maybe some of the ruins that are there may be from the city of old times there, but just kind of a normal place in the middle of Judea and stuff like that from some other pictures that we've seen before. And so Peter goes to Lydda and checks on the church there, and when he gets there, he finds in Lydda a man who is suffering. And that's something that we see in Scripture, that Scripture talks about a lot, something that we wonder about a lot. What about suffering? Why do we suffer? Why do we go through this? And actually here lately we've talked about suffering quite a bit through the different things that we've seen in the Scriptures. And that's what we see again here today. This is about people who are dealing with suffering. And there's always going to be suffering in this world. We just got to kind of resolve ourselves to that fact. There's always going to be suffering of some kind here. We'd like it to go away, but it's not going to. Not this side of heaven. And there's actually several scriptures that testify to that fact that it's going to be here. Let's look at Job. Job is the perfect example of suffering. In chapter 2, verse 10, Job says, "Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity?" So Job knows that there is good that's going to come, and there's also bad that's going to come. It's going to be there, and the Lord is the one who actually sends it. Sometimes God sends good. Sometimes God will allow bad things to happen as well. Then in Job chapter 30, verse 26, he talks about in his life how he tries for good things to happen, but that doesn't always work. He says, "But when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness." And so Job realized that even when he tried to make things the best that he could, that sometimes even bad things came, no matter how hard he worked for it. Paul talks to us in Romans chapter 8, and he says in verse 18, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." Paul knew that in this life there was suffering. Glory comes in the life to come. That's where the glory is. We'll get some glimpses of glory here. We'll get good times. Life is not all suffering. We enjoy a lot of things. But he said the true glory, the real glory, is what's going to come, not in this life here. In Romans chapter 8, verse 23, he says, "We also have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, eagerly waiting for the adoption, the redemption of our body." Paul knew that our flesh will not be redeemed until the return of Christ. And so even for us believers, even though our soul has been reborn, our soul is new, our minds are being changed, as he says in Romans chapter 12, the renewing of our minds, our flesh is still going to suffer. Even as believers, we're going to still deal with suffering here. The difference between us and the rest of the world is that our spirit has been changed, our mind is being changed, and so how we deal with that suffering of the flesh is what will make a difference. Jesus himself said in Matthew 26:11, for you will have the poor with you always. Now what does that mean about suffering? Jesus tells us there's always going to be poor people. Always. So there's always at least going to be people who are suffering with being poor. And he says they'll be here always, at all times. And so all the way till the end, there's going to be at least that kind of suffering. There's always going to be those. And Jesus himself admits that. James, in his letter in James 1, 2 through 4, he says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, which are a type of suffering, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. James tells us that as believers, we are going to face trials and we are going to face suffering. So it's going to be here. It will not be done until we are in heaven with Christ, because heaven is where there will be no more sorrow and no more pain. In Revelation 21, 1 through 4, John says, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no more sea. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people. God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. That's where suffering ends. Is when we get to be with Jesus. So as long as the earth is here, as long as this earth is here, as long as we're here on this earth, there's going to be suffering. And that stinks. You know, we don't like that. We don't want to hear that. Life's going to be a life of suffering. It's also a life of joy and goodness. And that's the great thing about the Holy Spirit and about Christ, is that even in the midst of suffering, we can have joy. Something that the world doesn't have. But since suffering is going to be here, God's going to use it. God's not going to let suffering get the best of him and the best of his purposes. He's not going to go, well, you guys are suffering, there's nothing I can do about it. You know, you just got to deal with it. Because God is greater than suffering, and he will use it for his good purposes. It's like everything else, you know. Things could be used for good or for bad. Take prosperity, kind of maybe the opposite of suffering. If you're prospering and things are going good, you know, prosperity is a blessing from God. But we can use prosperity for good to make our lives comfortable and to help other people who are in need, other people who are suffering. But we can use it for evil, because people take their prosperity and they use it to oppress others, or they turn their backs on God and they put their trust in their wealth and their prosperity instead of trusting in God. You see, so it can be used for one or the other. Well, so can suffering. God will use suffering, what was intended for evil, for his good purpose. And that shows the greatness and the sovereignty of God. That's something that the devil will relish in and bring in abundance to us. God says, well, I can use that. Because he's not going to let the devil get the best of it. He's going to show them that he's greater than him. So something that is a curse on this earth, God can use for his glory. And he's already using the suffering of others to benefit his church. Here in the scriptures that we've read, in verse 31, it says the church was enjoying a time of peace. Now, in last week's message, we read some notes from the New King James Version Study Bible that tells us about what historically was probably going on at this time. And it says that Tiberius, the emperor of Rome, had died around this time, and he was replaced by Caligula, the emperor, who wanted to erect a statue of himself at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, that was bad. The Jews weren't going to put up with that. You don't put a statue of a false god in the temple of the living God. And so the Jews, so upset about that, took their energy that they were putting into persecuting Christians and turned it on this bigger issue of dealing with the Romans trying to put a statue of the emperor in God's temple. And so we see God's sovereignty at work in this, in giving the early church a season of respite and a time of rest. God was using the suffering of the Jews to bless his church with a time of peace from Jewish persecution. So Peter was able to travel around a little more freely, and he was able to go to the churches and they used that time to spread the gospel even more. So what this also tells us is that even in a time of peace, there's still going to be suffering. Even if there's national peace, individuals and churches are going to suffer. And we see two examples of that and how God uses their suffering for his benefit. This first one is in this city of Lydda, where we see a man who is suffering. Again, in verse 33 it says, Peter found a certain man named Aeneas, who had been bedridden 8 years and was paralyzed. And Peter said to him, Aeneas, Jesus the Christ heals you. Arise and make your bed. And he arose immediately. So all who dwelt in Lydda and Sharon saw him and turned to the Lord. Now, Aeneas was suffering, paralyzed for 8 years where he couldn't get up. Now, we don't know if this man was a believer. It doesn't really say. We assume he was because it says that Peter went to the saints in Lydda. But we see in other places in this same chapter where he calls out people and calls them certain disciples. This person he calls just a certain man. So, he might be a believer, probably is, but he might not be. We don't know. But here's the thing. Even if he's a believer, he's still suffering. So just because we're believers, God doesn't take away all the pain. And God has caused this man to suffer, and he's using that suffering. First of all, he's using it in this way, so that other believers will have an opportunity to serve. Because since he can't get up and care for himself, the other believers, the other people there, have to help take care of him and have to help provide for him and have to help him in his daily life. And so they have to show their love for Christ by serving this man. And so his suffering gives them an opportunity to serve. So that's one way that God uses it. Another way is that this man has to rely on God to provide for him. He has to really rely on and trust in God to provide for him through other people and the things that are taking place. Because he can't get up and do it himself. He can't get up and go work, and he can't do the things that he needs to do. And look at the other believers today who are suffering from illness. One is a pretty famous Christian author, Johnny Erickson Tada, who became a paraplegic when she was a young lady. And she talks about how she has to rely on people every day, and she has to rely on God to provide for her. She talks a lot about not just physically providing for her, but also emotionally and spiritually. Other believers who are dealing with illness have to rely on God to help them live their life with their illness and continue on even in the midst of it. And they, in turn, are a witness to the rest of us of how we can rely, how we need to rely on God. Because a person who's going through something like that is an example to the rest of us, reminds us every day, that, yeah, they're relying on God, but so am I. Because, I might not be paralyzed. I can walk across this room. But I can only walk across this room because God gives me the ability to do that. He's kept me from being paralyzed or hurt. He gives me the strength. He provides the air to breathe, for the oxygen to go through my blood, to my legs, and all that stuff. And so a person like this reminds us of how much we all rely on God. And then we see God use it because God heals him. Peter sees this man suffering. He knows it'd be better for him to be able to walk. He knows it'd be better for him to be able to provide for himself so he's not a burden to other people. But more than that, Peter knows that if God heals him, it will show everyone, believers and non-believers, the power of God. So Jesus heals Aeneas of his paralysis, and because of that healing, many people in Lydda and the surrounding area turn to Christ. So Jesus uses illness for his good purpose. And so that's what we see. We may have to suffer with illness, but God will use that for his good work. And God also used the suffering of death. We just read here the story of Dorcas here in this story. And she was in Joppa. Now Joppa is up here. Here's Lydda. Here's Joppa. Joppa was about 11 miles from Lydda, about 30 miles south of Caesarea. Caesarea was a Roman city, the major port along the coastline of the Mediterranean. Joppa was a port city also, but not near as big as Caesarea, not near as important, but it was important to the Jews because it was a Jewish port, where Caesarea was a Roman port, and a harbor and all that stuff that was there. Joppa was very wealthy and the only significant Jewish port. So here's what we've got. This is a picture of the modern city of Tel Aviv in Israel. Big city, lots of people there. This area right in here, from what I understand, is ancient Joppa. This was the original city of Joppa. And the city of Tel Aviv grew up around it. But here's the original city of Joppa. And right here, this big building there is St. Peter's Church in Joppa. And so you can see the ancient harbor right in here, and where the boats would come in and dock. Here is another picture looking out on that harbor. You can see the smaller boats that are here. It is too small for like the big commercial boats and the big container ships and stuff like that. But it's large enough for fishing vessels and stuff to go into. So a lot of them still use that harbor today. As a matter of fact, they said this is one of the oldest functioning harbors in the world, is the city of Joppa. If we remember through the stories in the Old Testament, when Jonah ran from God, he went to Joppa, to this port here, and then got on a boat to go to Tarshish and to go the opposite way away from Nineveh. Also, it says that when they constructed Solomon's temple, they floated cedars from up north down to Joppa, and then those cedar trees were taken to Jerusalem. One more picture here. This is from the shoreline looking up at the St. Peter's Church. That church is built on what is traditionally the site where Peter was supposed to have received his vision from God, instructing him to go on up to Caesarea and to preach the gospel to the family of Cornelius. So that's the traditional site. Don't know if it is or not, but they built the church there to commemorate that spot. So that's a little information about Joppa, an important city, a busy city. Living in Joppa was a disciple named Tabitha, or Dorcas. Both of those names, Tabitha is Aramaic, Dorcas is Greek. They both mean gazelle, so her name was Gazelle. She was a disciple of great service. She had a heart to serve others and to help those in need. She especially liked to help the most needy, mainly the widows in the church. And I would imagine these are what Paul called the real widows, those women whose husbands died and they didn't have any other family members to take care of them and take them in. And of course, in that society, they couldn't go out and work and earn a living, so they were truly destitute. So they relied on the church to take care of them. And Dorcas saw as her ministry, as her service, to help these women. And a big thing that she did was she helped make clothes for them. And she provided those things. And she seemed to be really, really involved with them, because when she passed away, these ladies were destitute. They were distraught. They were really upset. And they just couldn't believe that she was gone. They missed her friendship, and they missed what she provided in her service. And these people were suffering. Now, Dorcas wasn't suffering anymore. You know, the scriptures tell us that to be absent in the flesh is to be present with the Lord. She was happy. She was with Christ. But these people were suffering because of her death. Now, she may have suffered leading to her death, but it was over. So God used the suffering of these people at the death of Dorcas, again, for his purpose. First of all, he caused the disciples to turn to God first. You know, when Dorcas passed away, they missed what she did. They were suffering her loss, and the place that the disciples turned to was to God. They said, God's the one who can help us. God's the one who can help us get through this situation. They didn't turn to a false god to help them. They didn't go back to their old Jewish ways. You know, they turned to Christ. They didn't turn to another person. They didn't turn to the government. They turned to Christ. And they knew that he was the only one who could help them deal with their loss. And they knew that God gave Peter the ability to raise people from the dead. And so when they heard that he was in Lydda, they said, hey, go get Peter. Maybe if he comes up here, he could pray, and maybe God will bring Dorcas back to life. And so God used that suffering to encourage these believers to turn to him first. Now, personal testimony of this, everybody knows pretty much what our family's gone through the past few months, through the summer and different things, and all the struggles. And when everything happened, I am very happy to say that my family, the first place they turned to was Christ. That's the first thing they did. when things started going bad, people started getting sick, and things were getting worse and worse, they turned to Christ first. They turned to Him and asked Him for help, and they gave the situation to Him. They didn't turn to other people. They didn't turn to science or medicine as their Savior. They turned to Christ. And then they asked Him to help with these different things. And they turned to Him first. And I see that that's what they're doing here. They looked and they saw, hey, the one who can help us is God. And so their suffering, the death of Dorcas, helped these disciples realize that God used that suffering. The second way that we see God use the death of Dorcas was to turn unbelievers to Christ. Verse 42, it says, and it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed on the Lord. Now when Jesus healed the paralytic in Lydda, many people saw His power and turned to follow Him. The same thing happened here when He raised Dorcas to life. They saw His power over life and death, and they knew that if He could raise Dorcas from the dead, well, He could help my life, my miserable life, my suffering and my pain. So if He could do that, then He can help me. And so God used the suffering of Dorcas' death to bring unbelievers to Christ. And again, we see this during a time of peace. There's suffering and there's pain, but God's not going to let it go to waste. He used the suffering of this paralytic man, and He used the suffering of the death of Dorcas for His good purpose. So the question is, how should we view suffering then? How should we look at it? You know, no one likes to suffer at any level. I got a splinter in my hand the other day, and that really bothered me. And that's nothing compared to what we deal with in other times. But does anybody sit here, did any of you go, hey, I got a splinter? That's great. We don't. I mean, that thing will bug you all day long. Especially if it's in the right spot. If it's on your thumb or something, and you're working and doing things, that thing's just going to nag and nag you all day. And you hate it. And the only thing you can do is go dig it out and get rid of it. We don't like suffering. If you did, that's kind of weird. We don't like suffering. Even Jesus did not like to suffer. Jesus told God that if there was any other way to save mankind without going through the suffering of the cross, then He would do that. In Luke chapter 22, verses 41 through 44, Jesus says, and Jesus was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and He knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. In other words, He knew He was going to the cross. This was in the Garden of Gethsemane, right before He died. He says, if there's any other way, let's get rid of this. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel appeared to him from heaven, strengthening him, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus didn't want to suffer. He didn't like it. He was in agony. He says, if we can do this some other way, let's do it. He didn't want to go through it. So what can we learn from this about Jesus and how He dealt with suffering? Well, first of all, don't desire it. It's kind of weird. There are people who think, oh, I need to suffer. I need to look for it. You know, it'd be kind of weird. You know, we all desire to be with the Lord and be in heaven. And heaven is a place of peace and the removal of suffering. Luke says in verse 31 of this that we just read that the disciples had a time of peace and edification. They loved that time of peace. Okay, but don't desire suffering and don't go looking for it. We don't want to look for it and bring it onto ourselves. But, you know, so don't desire it. But also, don't be surprised by it. It's going to come. Jesus knew it was coming. That is why He asked the Father if there's any other way, then let's do some other way. And Jesus knew that this world was full of suffering. He wasn't surprised by it. As a matter of fact, He used it Himself. In John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, it says that Jesus passed by. He saw a man who was blind from birth, and His disciples asked Him, saying, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. So why was he blind? That the works of God should be revealed in him. That man went through a lifetime so far of blindness, suffering, so that God's glory could be shown. And that's tough to accept. That would be. But Jesus used that. He wasn't surprised by it. Jesus knew that when he walked down that road, that man was going to be there. He knew that. So Jesus used it. He wasn't surprised at suffering. He didn't seek it out, but he wasn't surprised by it. So we shouldn't be surprised. When suffering comes upon us, we shouldn't be going, I really wonder, should we be going, Lord, why me? Because it's going to come. So what we need to do is expect suffering. Expect it. You know, God said it's going to be here. He's going to use it for his good purposes. Jesus expected the suffering of the cross. In Luke 24:46, Jesus told his disciples, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day." Jesus knew from the beginning he was going to suffer. He expected it. And we as believers are not exempt from it, so we should expect it to happen. As a matter of fact, think about this. God may send more suffering to us as believers so that we can be a witness to non-believers. Now, I don't like that either. I don't like that thought, that God may cause more suffering on my life than on the life of an unrighteous person so that I can be a witness to them. But that might be what he does. Maybe, maybe not. So what we need to do is then we need to use suffering for his glory. Use your suffering as an opportunity to be that witness. Don't let it go to waste in your life. If it's got to be there and you've got to endure it, you've got to go through it, and look at it the way God does and say, you know what? I'm not going to let the devil get the best of me. I'm going to use this. Let Jesus use it for his glory. Use it for believers to edify them and build them up. Show them what the Lord has done for you. Show them that it is the Lord who helps you get through. Show other believers that it is the Lord you turn to for help. And for non-believers, let them see the power of God in your life. Let them see what he can do. Even if it's just little things, the everyday things. They need to see that God is with us every day. You know, as Peter says, give them a reason for the hope that you have. Let them see that hope you have in your suffering. And then when they say, how do you deal with that? Tell them why. And then the last thing is, surrender your suffering then to Christ. You know, as believers, we give our life to Christ. And when we do that, most of us will go, you know what, Lord, I give you everything. I give you my family. I give you my home. I give you my work. It's all for you. And we expect God to use these things in our lives for his purposes. But here's a question I kind of thought of when I was looking over this. Have you given your suffering to God? Have we given God our suffering? And we said, Lord, I'm going to suffer, so I give it to you. You know, have you given him your health? And you said, God, my health is in your hands. Whether that means good health or whether that means bad. I give it to you. And I give you my comfort. Whether you give me comfort or that means you take it away. Have you told him to use your body? What's left of it anyway. A lot of us have suffered already. Have you given him your body to do work for him? Have you told him your health is for him so you can be his witness? That's a tough call. I'll tell you what, it's a lot easier to tell God, I give you my house, than I give you my health. You know, that's something I hadn't thought of before. Because he might take it away. You know? And he told him that your health is for him so you could be his witness. So that when he keeps you healthy, you can tell others it is God who sustains you, God who heals you, God who's gotten you from a sickness to health. So they can see what God can do. Or when God does not heal you, to show others the hope that you have in him. And a couple of quick examples I've got of that. Most of us here remember Sister Taylor, Helen Taylor. And it still amazes me. I'd go visit her in the nursing home. And I've told you guys this story many times. And she knew as she had cancer, and she knew she wasn't getting better. She wasn't going to leave that nursing home. But she used it. And she used it as an opportunity to tell every person that came into her room about the hope that she had in Jesus. That's all she did. You know, people saw her that she had hope, that she was full of joy, and that she trusted in God. And she told them what he did. I also knew a lady who was dying of cancer, and she knew this older couple, probably in their late 70s, maybe early 80s, didn't have many years left, I would say. And they were very stubborn against accepting Christ. People had witnessed to them before and they just wouldn't do it. And so they came to visit her, and she was literally on her deathbed, and she shared her faith with them, and they gave their lives to Christ. She led them to Jesus. And here's the thing, they probably wouldn't have listened to her if she wasn't sick and dying. But they saw that this woman who was dying at a fairly young age, I think she was maybe in her early 60s, dying of cancer, and she had hope in Christ, and they listened to her. So we need to surrender our suffering to Christ. So this is, I think, what Jesus shows us in his suffering, how maybe we should do suffering. Don't desire it, but don't be surprised by it. So expect it, it's coming. So since that's going to happen, use it for God's glory and surrender it to Christ so he can use it for his glory. So what we see is that Jesus will use our suffering for his good purpose. Now I said we've talked about this before, but maybe God's trying to get something across to us. Maybe we really need to see this. Maybe we really need to, in our own lives, maybe in the lives of others, we need to see God's got a plan for this. And let's use it. Let's use it for his glory. Suffering is going to happen, even in times of peace and prosperity, but God's not going to let it get festive. He will use it for his good purpose, and we do not need to be surprised by it, expect it, and give it to him to not only receive comfort from him through your suffering, but also to use for his glory. So that's something to look at when we see things that are going on. The suffering's going to be there, and it's going to keep you. So let's let God use it. We're going to